Hello again. I'm going to start by using a prayer from the American Book of Common Prayer that is titled For the Human Family. And I'm sharing this with you, bearing in mind the events going on around us involving violence and racism, and the need for us to think carefully, pray deeply, and act boldly as we see this great challenge of our time. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love. And work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purpose on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, I'm continuing with thinking about sacrifice and doing so in relation to the saga of Abraham in Genesis. And today I want to begin with the story of Abraham and Sarah's encounter with mysterious divine messages of the oaks of Mamre, Genesis 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. Well, this curious story may also seem to involve a challenge for me to relate back to the idea of sacrifice, as did the story of Melchizedek, because there is no explicit cultic language here at all. There's no mention of sacrifice, there's no mention of altar, and there isn't even mention of priest. So I'm one step further back. But of course, when you stop to think about the dynamic that's going on, those being entertained are not simply 3 travellers. The narrator begins the episode, "The Lord appeared to Abraham." When they make bread and slaughter a calf and bring it to these mysterious visitors, Sarah and Abraham are actually doing exactly what constitutes sacrifice in most cases in the Hebrew Bible. They are offering food to God, and they are sharing food with God as well as with one another. So even though there is no context of expiation or propitiation and no particular emphasis upon the act of violence done to the calf, although there is obviously a slaughter and a victim, the point of sacrifice here is primarily that of gift, and perhaps to a greater extent there's an emphasis on sacrifice as a means of sharing. Note that Abraham offers this meal, this hospitality, without any particular sense of expectation of reward. It's offered gratuitously, obviously in keeping with ancient Near Eastern norms of hospitality. And it's also true, although we didn't hear this in the part of the story that I read, that the promise of Isaac is tied to this gift, because you recall that the visitors will say that when they come back, in fact, that Sarah will bear a son. So there is, in fact, reciprocity going on, but Abraham doesn't offer his gift to God with the expectation that there will be a return. He offers it gratuitously. Now, they were doing more than feeding God, weren't they? Abraham and Sarah offer hospitality, which has a variety of elements, and one of the other interesting parts of the story that connects us, at least with diaconal ministry in particular, is the reference to washing feet. So foot washing, of course, is an ancient practice of hospitality that's very common in stories like this, and it's prominent in the imagery of the liturgy of the diaconal ordinations of common worship. in particular, and there it's linked to Jesus' own ministry and the famous story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. This is from the bishop's introduction to the ordination of deacons. Deacons are ordained so that the people of God may be better equipped to make Christ known. Theirs is a life of visible self-giving. Christ is the pattern of their calling and their commission. As he washed the feet of his disciples, so they must wash the feet of others. So these words, which some of you heard last year and others will hear in a few days, is applicable to all of us in its emphasis on a service that emulates the service of Christ, and which, again, I think we can see foreshadowed in the service which Abraham and Sarah offered to these divine visitors. The old ordinal of the Book of Common Prayer also gives a specific emphasis to acts of service, but it does so in slightly more blunt or practical terms. It talks about the deacon seeking out the sick and the poor. And it also begins the equivalent part of the ordinal of 1662 with this charming phrase, "It appertaineth to the office of a deacon in the church where he shall be appointed to serve, to assist the priest in divine service." Divine service is a phrase worth chewing on. Of course, it means worship. That's what that reference is to liturgical leadership. It's not so long ago that divine service was still used as a formal way of describing what would happen in churches on Sunday mornings. You may even know of places that still have such painted on a notice board outside a church. I can remember it from the 1960s at least. But of course, typically we've just abbreviated it so that we don't talk about divine service, but we talk about services. And this innocent abbreviation, I suspect, is actually theologically devastating, because there's a difference, isn't there, between divine service and our services. Just stop and ask yourself, when we think about planning services and when we have discussions with one another about what our services should be like, who is the implied audience of our theological or practical wranglings? You know the answer, don't you? Services are for the participants. Divine service is clearly for God. What's been lost? I like the phrase divine service better than a lot of our contemporary worship language. I'm not really going to carry a banner in any procession expecting to change things back, but it's a better phrase theologically than most contemporary worship language, not just that services stuff I just mentioned. Because, to be honest, across the spectrum, I think we see that our language and our theology of worship really lacks something. It isn't as robust as we might want it to be. On the Catholic side, we sometimes tend to think that the liturgy, in its dignity and order, is somehow adequate in itself because of that dignity and order, as though it was self-sufficient. On the evangelical side, it's remarkable that the word worship, which is of course related to that language of divine service, that the word worship seems to have been purloined by the musicians now without a whimper of resistance. If your theology of worship really implies a band, then that's not an adequate theology either. So that was an attempt at sort of equal opportunity offence there, by the way, in terms of our different approaches to these questions and problems. But let me go back to the Book of Common Prayer, the idea of divine service. Divine service is quaint and perhaps irretrievable, practically speaking, but it's unambiguous because it claims that the purpose of having assemblies in our churches is to serve God, to please God. And that, of course, links us back to the idea of sacrifice as well, that sacrifice, for all its curious and unwieldy materiality, the idea of offering God physical things which God doesn't really need, nevertheless reminds us that what we do in worship is about God rather than about human communities. We undertake liturgy and worship because we believe these things are acceptable to God. In the case of the Eucharist, because we're fulfilling a divine command, something sought by God, even though it's sometimes difficult to marry that seeking with some other aspects of our theology of what God expects from us. We believe that our praise and thanksgiving are not only acceptable to God, but sought by God. And that, of course, is the good heart of the contemporary theology of the praise and worship movement. So on a good day, both Catholic liturgy and evangelical praise are seeking to make an acceptable offering to God, believing that despite God's lack of any necessity, that God is nevertheless well pleased by these acts which we perform in obedience to God. But the heart of worship in that case is not the ritual or the music, it's the obedience. It's the fact that we go where God tells us to, that we do what God asks us to, that constitutes worship. If you look at the New Testament, the words that get translated as worship in almost any translation you could point to, or words that are sometimes translated even as with the word liturgy or service, they're not actually very specifically related to ritual. They're not very specifically related to prayer or let alone to music. They're about obedience and service. They're actually sort of ethical in thrust rather than ritual. So think of the most obvious examples in the New Testament. Satan wants Jesus to worship him. It wasn't about a musical item. The disciples worship Jesus in a boat after the storm. The disciples worship Jesus on a mountain and they discern his divine power and so forth. And all of these instances seem to involve physical performances that the worship sought, whether or not performed, is physically demonstrated in the prostration of individuals before the feet of the one who seeks worship. But even though that's got an embodied aspect, and therefore you could call it ritual, it's really the enactment of a relationship of dependence, of service, of obedience. So, having begun 2 talks ago by implicitly criticizing the way that sacrifice has been shifted from the ritual to the ethical realm, perhaps we've come full circle. My critique of sacrifice as ethic was not about its ethical interpretation so much as about the fact that what we assume the core of an ethic of sacrifice is self-abnegation, and in particular a form of self-abnegation that involves violence to the self, and implicitly the death of the giver, the sacrificer. Sacrifice is actually ethical. It is ethical, but its ethical core is gift and service. It's what we see Abraham and Sarah doing at the Oaks of Mamre. It's welcoming the stranger, seeking out those who are in deepest need and sharing what we have with them. It's gift, it's service, not violence, not self-abnegation, but the offering of gift in the hope of forming relationship. The service of God and the service of God's people is likewise gift and sacrifice, invited from us by God, whether it's in a liturgical setting or in a completely different setting, such as social outreach or evangelism or anywhere else. God seeks our worship in our service of one another, not simply because we're performing some kind of abstract ethical duty in service, but because we are obeying our God. The difference between ethics and ritual, thus, in an authentic theology of worship and of service, is overcome.